everybody, and thank you very much to our witness, Philip Tunley, who's here by video conference from Toronto. My understanding is that Mr. Henheffer is not going to be able to make it, so we have just the one witness today. And this is our first meeting on our study on the state of the free press. And so today's meeting, Philip Tunley is the president of the board of directors of the Canadian Journalists for Free Expression. So we're very pleased to have you with us, Mr. Tunley, and we'll start with your comments for about 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to the committee, and thank you for inviting me to testify on behalf of CJFE. I am currently the president, although you should know I'm not a journalist. I'm actually a lawyer. My practice includes representing and defending and supporting the media in Canada. So that's my claim to be the president at the present time. In my remarks, I'd just like briefly to touch on three key areas of the environment surrounding journalism today. And if I may start with the government environment, I think the committee knows it's been a challenging year for the media and free expression in Canada and around the world. I'll give just three examples of many, obviously, which could have been chosen. In the Middle East, first of all, I think, as everyone's aware, we have an allied country whose government, according to U.S. security and intelligence services, may be responsible for the brutal murder of a Washington Post journalist in that country's own embassy. We usually think of embassies as a safe haven for travelers. So this is one instance. It's not the only one. In the United States, we have a president claiming in the United States District Court that he has, quote, absolute discretion, end quote, to strip a long-standing, long-accredited member of the White House Correspondents Association of his hard pass and his access to the White House, and ultimately of his career as a journalist. Here in Ontario, we have a premier who believes he can divert taxpayers' money provided to support the legislative and constituency responsibilities of his caucus to fund his own private news outlet called Ontario News Now. So those are three examples, all government actions, and in my view, how Canadians and how Canadian laws and institutions react to these and other events in the government environment will be critical tests, I think, of our commitment, not just to the free press, but also to the rule of law. So if I turn then to the economic environment, I think, again, the committee will well understand the business climate for news media is another problem area. At a very high level, and there's lots of detailed studies that go into more detail, but two main causes are cited. The first, of course, is a major draw of advertising revenue away from traditional media that are involved in journalism, as we traditionally understand it, and towards social media that are not involved in journalism. That's the first cause. The other, of course, is a serious decline in audiences, particularly and significantly among younger generations. So it's really in that context that I looked at the finance minister's recent announcements, which include a trial balloon, I would say, on possible measures to address the resulting financial pressures on media. I have a number of points. First of all, I think this has rightly begun as a consultation, not a prescription, and I think that is a good thing. Government funding of our free press is controversial, even among journalists. It will be essential for the government and for Parliament to hear strongly held opposing views on both sides before choosing among options in this area. I'm happy to take your questions on those issues, but I offer this. One of the options put forward by the finance minister's recent statement would give the tax credit to subscribers rather than directly to media outlets. I have to say that appeals to me because it directly addresses one of the two underlying causes that I've just identified, the problem of declining audiences, which leads me to another thought. What about a tax credit for advertisers who place their advertising in major media? Obviously, these options, however you structure them, are not going to completely avoid the need for a process to identify those outlets who should receive public subsidy, presumably because they are contributing to our values and our goals for a free press in Canada. This is where most of the debate and controversy arises. It's not an easy topic, and we won't solve it in this hour, I'm sure. However, these options both would give the public and advertisers a say in which media receive how much of the available government funding, if there is to be any. But they also, I think importantly, subject the media who receive those subsidies to some, at least some basic market disciplines in terms of earning the support that the government may be prepared to offer, or at least make available. So lastly, I just want to briefly turn to the legal environment, obviously the area that I know most directly and the best. And in this area, I think we have a little more cause for optimism. A number of developments in recent years have been positive in I think, everyone's view who deals with media and represents their interests in the legal process. The first, of course, the passage by Parliament last year of the Journalist Sources Protection Act brings long overdue protection to a critical area of news reporting, which is the protection of sources. I think you as parliamentarians all know that the ability to speak to the press off the record, to give background without attribution, it's critical, the discourse between sources and journalists, and protecting that discourse and that discussion and that exchange of information from undue intervention in the legal system is critical. The interpretation of the protections for journalists created and sources created by that act is already before the Supreme Court of Canada in a hearing that will take place in the spring, and we look forward to the court's interpretation. The second legislative initiative, I think, is worth noting. Many provinces, including recently the province of Ontario, have now enacted anti-SLAPP laws. SLAPP, the term SLAPP, strategic lawsuits against public participation, are unfortunately still far too common in Canada, and they include actions brought by large corporations in Canada and others. Recent decisions by our Ontario Court of Appeal interpreting the new Ontario statute are very welcome in giving strong effect to the deterrent aspects of the legislation, and particularly in terms of litigation that targets free speech. I think Parliament has before it currently in the Senate the reform of the Federal Access to Information Act. CGFE has contributed to that process recently, and we look forward to your deliberations. In terms of the courts, courts across Canada continue to implement recent decisions by the Supreme Court, which have strengthened key defenses in libel actions. The defense of fair comment on matters of public interest is of particular importance to your deliberations, and that was strengthened by the court some years ago in WIC Radio. The defense of responsible communication, which was developed by the court and accepted by the court recently in Grant and Torstar, has been applied now several times and is a very welcome addition to the defenses for appropriate media reporting in our court system. Where I think I would identify a need for more protective legislation and more judicial awareness and sensitivity is in terms of the role of the media reporting on our criminal justice system. I say, unfortunately, publication bans, whether they are imposed by statute or discretionary on the part of the judges sitting on criminal cases really seem to be increasingly the norm, not the exception. And I say it should be the exception because our charter defines the right to a fair trial. Everybody talks about the right to a fair trial. It's actually the right to a fair and public trial. And the public nature of a criminal trial is very important. And the ability
if you could come to your conclusion, because that is 10 minutes there. Sorry.
Really, that was it. The other aspect of the criminal system, which is problematic, are the production and assistance orders that are routinely made by the RCMP and other police outlets. So in summary, there's lots for this committee to be concerned about, but also I would say lots of progress that you can build on in the work of this committee. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tunley, for your presentation. I would like to remind that, of course, our committee is a subcommittee of the Foreign Affairs Committee. It's not a legislative committee, so our study is global in scope, and we will be looking at the state of the free press around the world. With that, of course, part of this discussion is to see what scoping areas thematically or even country-specific that we could be looking at in our study. So I will start with the questions with that regard, and we will begin for 7 minutes with Mr. Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank you for being with us here today. I guess a place I would like to start is there a market economy for media, for it to be able to stand on its own 2 feet economically, or do we, by necessity, do we require taxpayers' money to support the media industry right now?
I would say the free press has always been independent and will always find a way to fund its activities. There are other sources besides public money to support it. In the past, there have been support from political movements, from business leaders, and from all areas. I think at this time, the real challenge economically is the competition from social media. It's about getting a message out, obviously. But it's also about reporting on what's happening in Canada and around the world.
Would the position of your organization be then that the taxpayers have some sort of responsibility to protect the industry from basically being uncompetitive because of changing technology? Would your organization take that position that there's some necessity for taxpayers' money to be involved in supporting media right now, or would you not see that as a necessity?
I would repeat what I said. I mean, the question you're asking would be controversial among journalists. You will hear different views on both sides, and you'll see that in the commentary on it right now. I think as a spokesman for the Canadian Journalists for Free Expression, I have to say that there are times when it's more important for government to step up. This is a particularly challenging time in terms of business and other options for funding. And I think there's room for government action at the present time.
So how do you avoid, I'll call it contamination, or how do you promote independence by anyone who's receiving government money? Because we're actually accused of, as political leaders, of not being able to take more than, a $150 or $200 gift, or it will influence us. And yet we see a massive commitment right now towards funding media in this country. I'm just wondering, around the world, we see governments intimidating and influencing media. How do we avoid that kind of, it's almost an inherent thing that happens when people receive government money, that they feel an obligation then to support it?
I think the 2 suggestions I made in terms of routing the funding, if there is to be public funding, through subscribers or through advertisers, is a way to distance, takes the decision-making, the direct decision-making out of government hands. There's a suggestion of setting up an expert panel. I think at the end of the day, there won't be much controversy around which outlets today really are serving the interests of society in a free press, reporting stories on a current basis that are of interest to the press, that are supportive of our democratic process. And there won't be a lot of controversy around that. And it will be the major media, not the social media, that are doing that to a very large extent.
It will
Not
be are you saying
exclusively.
it will be the mainstream media that will present that information better than social media does? Is that what you're saying?
Well, what I'm saying is when you talk about funding the free press, you're talking about funding the fact-finding process, the news-gathering process, which is really only undertaken by the major media and a very few new online media outlets. I think we all know who they are. But those are the ones who are doing the job of really ferreting out stories independently rather than just reacting to an ongoing political debate.
I'm not sure it'll be as simple as that, but I want to ask you a little bit about the notion that of a government-appointed committee then to determine who actually can access those tax credits. You seem to be comfortable with that notion. I think for some of us that would make us very uncomfortable. I'm wondering if you could just comment on that as well.
Well, I'm comfortable with it because we do it in all kinds of other areas. We set up arm's length expert committees to fund the arts. We set up arm's length expert committees to fund a variety of activities that need some universities that need some independence from government to function effectively. And I don't think there's any lack of will on the part of government or on the part of journalists to work out an institution that would work in our industry.
I get the sense that you don't think that there's kind of widespread cynicism about mainstream media, and I certainly run into that in my writing. I'm just wondering if you'd be interested in commenting on that. People get their information primarily now from Facebook and from social media. It's not from the mainstream media when you look at the survey results. And I'm just wondering, are you suggesting that we need to counter that so that we elevate the one and then try to bring the other one down to a more realistic notion that it's more of a social conversation than it is a news outlet or a news venue?
So I think the answer lies in our notions of what is journalism that's worth support. And I think a lot of what appears on social media is not in that category. Some is, but not always. So journalism, to be independent, has to be actively fact gathering, has to be actively questioning those in power. And a lot of social media is not. It's in fact the opposite of those things.
It's just interesting then to me. I think there was a study out of Harvard University about CNN's coverage of the president's kind of news in the United States. 93 or 97% of it, in their opinion, was slanted one direction. Would you consider that to be unbiased coverage from a mainstream news media? And then a second question. I think I'm going to run out of time here.
30 seconds.
Okay, I'd like to have you talk a little bit about VPNs, virtual private networks around the world, and the necessity for them. We've got nations now that are banning them. I've talked to internet security people who don't understand why we don't all subscribe to them, but I'm just interested in your perspective on that as well.
I'm not an expert on private networks, and I won't have a lot to say about that. It's kind of the opposite of journalism to be on a private network.
Okay, and actually you are out of time in any case. So we will be going to Ms. Khalid for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your testimony today. I want to, first of all, I want to say that I think journalism and journalists are basically the watchdogs of any democracy around the world, and their role is very important to ensure that that a government and states are acting transparently, and that the public has a right to know what is going on. And then, with that, I want to talk a little bit about the impact of this phenomenon that is fake news and how that impacts freedom of expression of investigative journalism and mainstream journalism. And we've seen around the world allegations of fake news impacting elections or swaying public opinions. What is your take on that?
So I would want to distinguish between what we can all objectively look at and verify is in fact fake news. It is reporting facts which are knowingly false and which is designed to actually disrupt and interfere with our democratic process or That to me is fake news. But then there's also the phenomenon of the accusation. It's very easy. It's an easy accusation to make. It's one of these buzzwords now that has been popularized, and so when challenged, the hallmark of good journalism is that when challenged, as you are fake news, a good journalist, a good media outlet can say, no, here are my sources. This is how we went through the process of verifying for your benefit what we're saying. And that, to my mind, going back to the earlier questioning, that's what distinguishes what's worth supporting in any kind of system, whether it's in Canada or around the world, is the journalism that is able to back up its claims and its statements.
Do you think that the phenomena of the internet and the easy access to information has created issues for journalists in their reporting to be able to get that news out accurately to the public of any state?
I think it's created opportunities that some media have yet to fully exploit, and I think that's one of the reasons why those who are investing in the internet as a way of getting their word out. The challenge is, of course, how do you charge for that? Because so much of the internet is free. If you are going to fund an activity that is a fact-gathering activity and that has validity as journalism, you can't give it away. So I think that's the challenge. The internet is a wonderful thing. It's like the printing press. It's like all the things that eventually will make free expression greater and more effective and reach more people. But its first introduction is causing some serious disruptions, which I think are a reason to consider measures to sustain what we value truly in the media.
So just changing tracks just a little bit. In this subcommittee, we hear a lot from journalists as they try to report on abuses that occur around the world, risking their lives to do that. Can I get your thoughts on the international community's response or proactive measures to protect journalism and the freedom of the press?
Right. So one of the greatest initiatives that I've been involved in at CGFE was I came involved after its initiation, but was the creation of the IFEX network. International Freedom of Expression Exchange is a group of, I think it's now over 100 journalism organizations worldwide, which exchange information, actively intervene to protect journalists. We at CGFE have a program called Journalists in Distress, where we contribute funding when journalists in foreign countries are persecuted, face death. We're privileged really in a country like Canada to be able to play that role, and we are constantly looking for new ways to intervene and support the free press in other countries, which is so critical to their emergence from dictatorship and to their emergence into mature participants in the international community.
So I have 2 minutes. Okay. So in your opinion, what is the biggest challenge of our time for journalists, given the climate, given the opportunity of social media and the internet, and also given the high rise of extremism and just really extremist views across the world, fascism and populism? What is the biggest challenge, do you think, that journalists are facing within our time, and how can we address those challenges?
I wish it was just one. I mean, I think you've listed many. Unfortunately, many governments around the world feel that they can act with impunity, and they wish to act against journalists because they are kind of the first line of critique. Very shortly after the free press in a given country is undermined and is subverted, you will find the independent bar and the independent judges are the next in line, and so journalists are the first to be exposed when a government is seeking to implement repressive measures, because what they want to do is protect what they are doing from scrutiny from around the world, from pressure from the United Nations. So it's really a critical gatekeeper, and I think that's why it needs to be maintained in every with all our efforts. Not only in Canada, but we have a role to support journalism around the world if we want to have, vibrant economic and political partners in the community of nations.
Okay, thank you very much. And now we'll go to Ms. Hardcastle for 7 minutes, and we will be doing another 3-minute round for everybody afterwards.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Tunley. I want to stay on the international human rights lens of press freedom right now. And we do know that the independence of major print and broadcast outlets are being undermined. We know that the press freedom that we deal with in international human rights, it's coming under pressure, not just in major democracies, but in repressive states as well. There was a time when our major democracies had healthy and viable news outlets that had international bureaus. Do you find, or what is your observation on how that is changing and how that is contributing to weakening the coverage of human rights and the link of that? And I would like it if you could try and focus on that thread instead of this business model aspect and these other pressures, because we could go down a rabbit hole. I have a journalism degree. I think we should be teaching how to tell the difference between journalism and opinion columns that are polished up. We should be doing this starting probably when kids are learning how to read. So with that being said, let's talk about some of the international coverage that is done by bona fide news sources and perhaps even the threats to journalists that try and do so today.
So I think that the ideal of one journalist organization that can cover news all around the world is very challenging to support today. There's very fewer and fewer media can rise to that level of activity. What we're seeing, and we see it in investigative journalism within Canada as well, is a lot more collaboration, a lot more networking, which I think is essential. And what it requires is the creation, the encouragement of a community of journalists where we recognize and respect good journalism wherever we find it, and we agree to use the best of the profession within Canadian media. I think that's a critical point. I think there are other points that you're raising as well, but I think it's linked to the economic model, unfortunately, because we can't afford to do it outlet by outlet anymore, if we ever could.
Mm-hmm. Do you see a correlation to the assertion or the attack on journalism when it's at its weakest? Do you think, and I'm just going to put air quotes around heyday of traditional media, meaning before social media started to be used more often and before that kicked in? Would something like, for instance, Egyptian authorities have blocked hundreds of websites for allegedly supporting terrorism, including news sources. Now, this is a fairly new form of attack on journalism, isn't it? Can you differentiate or just kind of expand on that idea of why there is such? Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I think, first of all, you have to realize where the problem comes from. Social media, citizen journalism of all kinds is a fantastic new resource for reporters, for journalists around the world to get a view of current events in distant places. And what these kinds of initiatives by governments that you're describing are designed to shut that down. are designed to stop the sources of information that are now becoming available that were never available before. It was very easy to stop people leaving the country or newspapers or leaving the country. It's very hard to stop video from spreading through the internet. So, and the video is, of course, high quality fact. The difficulty that journalists face, and which still requires a lot of discipline on their part, is to separate what's real video, genuinely taken and unedited, untampered with, from the vast amounts of false information that governments themselves and others are generating and circulating on the internet. So there's still a challenge, and part of it is a technological challenge. But that's what good journalism is about. There's actually an opportunity here, and the reactions of governments like the one you've mentioned have to be seen in that context.
Minutes.
Thank you. And then further to that, you had mentioned earlier in your opening comments about the things happening in the Middle East. That was an early onset phenomenon that we could all start thinking about journalism and some of these implications. Do you have any takeaways or recommendations to this committee, basically coming from that on what you think our approach should be in terms of international human rights facilitation?
It's a very hard choice that has to be made as to how far you push other countries. There's a diplomatic choice to be made. But I think for journalists, the murder of Mr. Khashoggi is so brazen and extreme that it needs more than just a kind of indignant reaction. It needs more than just words. And I think that's the perspective that I think every journalist would bring. This is a very serious crime, an international crime, a crime motivated by someone who is pursuing their profession as a journalism, an attempt to silence them, and that makes it very egregious.
Thank you very much. And now we will do a second round, but we'll limit the questions to 3-minute rounds because we have some committee business to do at the end. And we will start with Mr. Tabara for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the witness for being with us today. Overall, the world's rankings of press freedom fell in 2008, and the Reporters Without Borders reported that it was due to a variety of factors, including war, growing threats from non-state operatives, civil unrest, economic crisis, and the list goes on. Can you mention a bit about that and add your perspective to that?
So I think the process of reporting on press freedom on an indexed basis is a good one. It's not very scientific. It's not completely accurate, but it gives you a general measure of where things are trending up or down. And I think there's no doubt in recent years we've seen trending downwards, and there's a lot of reasons for that. And I think you're right. The report isn't just focusing on one thing. There's a number of factors involved.
Do you think that this is a new phenomenon, or do you think that with the rise of technology, can you give us a breakdown maybe of what we've seen in the past, maybe, if you go back 30, 40 years? Has there been more of an attack towards journalism? Has there been more? How has that changed over 30, 40 years?
So I think, I think that much more information is available to me as a viewer today, if I go looking for it, than was true 30 or 40 years ago. So in that sense, we've had a massive increase. The problem is, how does that get filtered through some kind of editorial journalistic process to separate out what is really going on from lots of stuff that's out there? It's the big challenge is the the business of journalism being to select the stories that are important, to get the facts and report them fairly and accurately, and to editorialize around the messages that Canadians or audiences around the world need to hear.
In terms of states that have authoritarian regimes, what are some of the tools and methods that they're using? My colleague across the way mentioned, they could block websites and other measures. They could be, monitoring what you're posting on maybe a certain blog that you're putting up. What other measures are they taking? Obviously, they're threatening journalists and even activists, but what other measures are they taking?
And unfortunately, you're going to have to hold that answer because that's your time. So we will go to Mr. Sweet.
Mr. Tunley, I just want to thank you for your testimony here. I wanted to do a pitch for our committee. One of the challenges that we face is that we hear story after story internationally about people who are suffering, whether it's the Uyghurs or Christians or Tibetans or Rohingya. They're always desperate, and we find that there's an underrepresentation of that suffering in Canadian journalism, and I certainly would not want to appear like I would like to just say, maybe encourage your colleagues that if they wanted to do one or two more stories regarding international human rights, we would certainly appreciate it. Sometimes we do press conferences and we show up down in the press gallery and there's no one there. And so I think there is an appetite from the discussions I've had with Canadians over the last, I've been on this committee now, this is my 13th year, and they're always surprised when I tell them a story about it, and they say, well, how would I ever hear about that? And so maybe that's something that you could take back to your colleagues. But the last part of my time, I want to give you the opportunity to share with us, for journalists that are persecuted, that are incarcerated, that are maybe killed, what is I understand that your organizations will send a letter to ambassadors in Canada when there's journalists that are mistreated. But do you have other initiatives where your members contribute so that you can support families of journalists that are being abused, et cetera? I'll let you go ahead.
The main one is our Journalist in Distress program. We do provide funding to selected candidates who are in distress. Either they are threatened or they are having to flee from threats of violence, and they need money for medical support. They need money for travel to a safe place. And we try to be, as part of a global community of free speech and journalism organizations, we contribute to that process. But the other is the journalists who arrive here in Canada, right? So we have a Journalists in Exile program. We work with the Journalists in Exile group to try and get training for journalists so that they can continue their careers here and so on. I'd like to comment on your first point, but I'm not sure I have time.
You've got 30 seconds to comment on that.
Okay. So I really think that one of the issues is people actually have a lot more access to stories around the world, particularly of suffering around the world. And there is a kind of, one of the problems that media have is there's a kind of, I've had enough of this. I don't want to hear at a certain point, and it doesn't sell newspapers. So if you want that journalism, it's part of this economic problem that I've started with. You've got to incent that kind of reporting, and I really feel it's important to do so. I agree with the sentiment underlining your comments.
Thank you very much. We will go to 3 minutes for Mr. Saini.
Thank you very much for your comments, Mr. Tunley. I want to talk to you about something that we see in the world, especially in Europe. We see this rising level of populism. And this rising level of populism is happening in democratic countries, where you have ambitious leaders who are populist leaders, whose intimidation of the press works in very subtle ways. Either they're supporters or I guess, people who are aligned with their way of thinking tend to either spend their resources in either, operating newspapers, radio stations, or TV stations. So there's a different, a more sort of subtle way of controlling the media. In other ways also of oppressing certain dissent, making sure that certain news is not come forward, whether through social media and other things. So, I mean, we can understand that in democratic countries, in strong democratic countries, there is a certain element of press freedom, and there are going to be countries where there's going to be very little press freedom. But what do you think, what is your comment on those countries that are democratically elected, but they have populist leaders whose supporters, in many ways, are using the press as a tool to continue that populism by either intimidating journalists or having a higher concentration of the media outlets there? What happens in that middle ground of those countries where you have democratically elected leaders? How do you deal with that phenomenon?
Well, I think you have to view it as a marketplace of ideas. I think, first of all, and you have to rely on people to critically assess, and it won't be everyone who does, of course, but first of all, it's social media, I think, rather than the mainstream media, which feed the populism, and to some extent you can't criticize. There are groups who can now communicate and share ideas in ways that they could not in the past, thanks to social media. So that's partly behind the phenomenon. What should be the reaction of major media or governments in that circumstance? I think it is a democratic process. It is a marketplace of ideas. And the only response, the only credible response at the end of the day is a political one and a journalistic one, to report facts, to correct errors, and to make sure that the discourse comes back to the things that matter to Canadians and others.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And for the last question, we'll go to Ms. Hardcastle for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Tunley, I'm also just thinking about some of the reporting that was done early on in Myanmar about what was happening to the Rohingya. And I guess I know that there are, you mentioned the Journalists in Distress program and Journalists in Exile. Two different programs. I don't know how long they've been going on. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the challenges, how they've changed, and also how are they being funded? Is there any government funding for either of these initiatives? Do you see an opportunity where we could be fortifying journalism through these types of programs?
Right. So the answer is that we have been funding our Journalists in Distress program, which is the more difficult of the two to fund, internally. So it comes from our general revenues that we raise from our gala, from our members. We would love to stabilize that funding with either a long-term private or a long-time government funding source. It is critically important work. It's work that no one else is doing. None of the journalist organizations in Canada other than CGFE do this. We're very, very proud of it. It originates from our relationship with the IFEX organization, which I mentioned earlier. So it's a wonderful program. In terms of getting journalists here, the Journalists in Exile program, there you've got to really deal with media in terms of their, major media in terms of their hiring policies. How do you encourage media here to hire journalists from Iraq or wherever, Mexico? And the second thing you've got to do is some training, because although the basics of journalism don't change, some of the realities of practice in journalism here do.
1 minute. 1 minute. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say I don't have any other questions if you want to expand on that. Otherwise, I'm done.
Okay. Just 1 minute then. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'd wanted to ask this earlier. In your viewpoint, women journalists, what are the issues that they deal with that are unique from their male counterparts, and what kind of support systems does your organization provide to women journalists across the world?
So I'm obviously not the right person to ask, but I think the answer is that women do face special vulnerabilities especially when they're reporting around the world. We've got some wonderfully courageous journalists who have been through that. but we've also got some sad stories of the results that can occur. So what kind of supports do we have for that? It's hard to target, right? It's very hard to devise a program that's aimed at those circumstances. And so I think most we can do is to encourage best practices in the major media who have correspondents around the world to ensure that they have appropriate security and other measures in place to support the work of these journalists.
Thank you.
It's really at the level of the media organizations.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Mr. Tunley, for your expert testimony. And I think that this has given us some ideas in terms of the study going forward. So thank you for being here through video conference. We'll now go in camera for 15 minutes to do some committee business. So I will suspend. Thank you.